Draco Malfoy, and why in Merlin's name is it always Harry? My Draco will hear about this. Chapter 4. What looked to be a fun tournament. Their workload for this year has increased significantly in the face of the OWL exams they would be taking at the end of their 5th year, and Draco was thankful that it kept them occupied. Not only was it keeping Harry too busy to worry himself sick over Sirius, who had sent an answer that he was back in the country and well hidden, but it also kept Hermione from obsessing more about her elf rights organization than she already did. Between the unfortunate and dangerous crossbreeds Hagrid had dragged into class as a pet project, and Moody performing the Imperious Curse on them in class, expecting them to be able to throw it off without instructions, and by the mere help of his taunts, at least in case of the Slytherin students, they spent most of their free time in the library studying. It was when the arrival of the rivaling schools for the Triwizard Tournament was announced, though, that the buzz of pleasant anticipation rolled through the school again. Discussions about who would be best suited as Hogwarts champion were dominating the student landscape, followed closely by what was to be expected from the students of the other schools and what the champions would have to face in the tournament. In addition, the staff gave it their best efforts to polish both castle and students into giving the very best impression to their foreign guests. The day of their arrival came one evening before Halloween, and the castle was clean and shiny in a way Draco had never seen it before, with the great hall decorated in festive house banners. Afternoon classes were to end half an hour early, which meant their double potion sessions was cut short, much to Harry's delight, and they were asked to drop their things off in their dormitories and assemble down in the entrance hall. They were ordered about by their heads of houses until they had all taken orderly positions on the front steps. Draco, much to his dismay, was standing in between Daphne Greengrass on one side and Theodore Nott on the other, and Nott kept muttering taunts to Draco under his breath, apparently enjoying himself immensely. "I'd make sure to play nice with the Durmstrang students, Malfoy," he smirked. "From what I heard, your father is one step away from sending you there, and we don't want any accidents to happen, do we? They are all your superiors in dark arts, after all. I think your father hopes they will set you straight, but I think they just finish you off before your first letter, in which you'd be pleading your mother for help naturally, had even reached Wiltshire." "Durmstrang doesn't sound half bad right now," Draco drawled without looking at him. "At least I'd be rid of a bumbling idiot like you." "I'd love to see you trying to survive without St. Potter to hide behind," Nott scoffed. "You wouldn't last
Theodore, would you please shut up and leave it be?"
Parkinson interrupted from next to him, her tone exasperated.
"Your incessant prattling is giving me a headache."
Both Draco and Nott started at her words, unused to anyone interfering with Nan's bullying. "What's this, Pansy?" Nott countered, raising both eyebrows and turning to look at her. "Don't tell me you care about what happens to dear Draco. Do you fancy him?"
"Oh, please, grow up," she sniffed, rolling her eyes. "I can complain about you being a pain in the butt without—"
"Miss Parkinson and Mr. Nott, if you don't lower your voice, I will feed you both to the giant squid before the other schools have time to arrive. Just to make sure you will not embarrass Hogwarts by the nonsense that tends to come out of your mouths." Both Nott and Parkinson fell silent at Snape's threat, looking sufficiently abashed. The silence that stretched out between them was broken by Dumbledore, who suddenly called out from the back rows, "Aha! Unless I am very much mistaken, the delegation from Beauxbatons approaches." Murmuring broke out among the students until finally the attention of everyone was drawn to the sky, where something indistinct was nearing the school in fast speed. First, Draco wondered if they had traveled by broom, but quickly discarded the idea. A broom ride was chilly under the best of circumstances, and not something a delegation used to southern European weather would be able to handle easily. Not to mention that from what he had heard of Beauxbatons, it was a very elegant institution, and he was sure they'd want to make a more spectacular entrance befitting of their style. And as they approached, it turned out that he had been correct.
The indistinct shape in the sky turned out to be a pastel blue carriage with an intricately carved exterior drawn by a flock of huge Palomino Pegasi. They landed with a considerable sound of impact that made some students stumble backwards in alarm and came to a halt not far from where the Hogwarts students and staff were waiting. The school crest was carved into the doors of the carriage, and they opened to reveal a male student in pale blue robes who stepped out to unfold a set of golden stairs. He then stepped back to make room for an elegant woman about the size of Hagrid, who was clearly the headmistress. Dumbledore initiated applause, with staff and students joining in immediately, making the headmistress of Beauxbatons smile as she approached her colleague, stretching out a hand for Dumbledore to kiss.
"My dear Madame Maxine," he said, "welcome to Hogwarts."
They proceeded to exchange pleasantries, Madame Maxine in heavily accented English, and Dumbledore in his usual charming manner. Meanwhile, the Beauxbatons students were filing out of the carriage, shivering from the Scottish cold in their thin satin uniforms and throwing apprehensive looks up at the castle. Draco had been guest to the French Pureblood Society often enough to know that Hogwarts must seem rather rustical in comparison to what they were used to. Their headmistress then led into the warmth of the castle, and the Hogwarts students and staff remained outside waiting for the Durmstrang delegation. They did not need to wait for long. Only moments after the last Beauxbaton student had stepped inside, a dim rumbling sound reached them from the direction of the lake, and then the water's surface broke out into circular waves emanating from its center. A gigantic ship rose out of the water and approached the bank. The ship docked, and soon students were filing out onto the Hogwarts grounds across a plank. Unlike the Beauxbaton students, they were wearing fur coats, which Draco assumed was a necessary part of their school uniform in order to not freeze to death wherever Durmstrang was situated. Their headmaster, who leading the delegation up to the castle, was sized like a normal human being and silver-haired. Draco watched him for a moment, remembering that he was an acquaintance of his father's. That could mean nothing good, he decided. Durmstrang's headmaster approached Dumbledore with a smile on his face.
"Dumbledore, how are you, my dear fellow? How are you?" "Blooming, thank you, Professor Karkaroff."
Dumbledore replied equally as heartily and shook hands with him.
"Dear old Hogwarts."
Professor Karkaroff sighed as he looked up at the castle. His English was lightly accented as well, though by far not as strongly as Madame Maxine's had been.
"How good it is to be here. How good."
He turned towards his students and beckoned.
"Victor, come along into the warmth. You don't mind, Dumbledore. Victor has a slight head cold."
Gasps and murmurs broke through the crowd of students, and Draco stared, unable to believe his eyes, as none other than Victor Crumb stepped forward. "Salazar's dirty paints!" Nat muttered next to him, and for once Draco was willing to agree. The students were in an uproar as they entered the Great Hall, heads turning left and right to get a glimpse of Crumb. Draco chose to have more dignity than them, not because he was less excited, but because he had been friends with Harry long enough to know how uncomfortable it was for celebrities to be stared at, and pushed his way through the crowd, taking his usual seat at the Slytherin table, far off from most other students. The Beauxbatons had joined the Ravenclaw table, but seemed unwilling to communicate with the other students. They were huddled together, wrapped up in their shawls, and grumbling among each other in French. He watched them for a moment until someone stood in his field of vision, and he looked up to find none other than Crumb himself across the table, an unsure frown on his face.
"Is this place free?"
he asked in a gruff voice.
"Yes."
Draco nodded, rather dumbstruck, indicating to the bench across from him in a politeness his parents had bred into him. "Please sit." Crumb nodded in thanks and lowered himself onto the bench, quickly followed by most of the other Durmstrang students. Draco noted that Crumb seemed keen to keep some distance between himself and the people that were staring at him. Maybe that was why he had chosen to sit with Draco, who had been keeping his distance himself, minding his own business like he usually did at his house table. Draco threw a quick look over at the Gryffindor table, finding the eyes of his friends on him. Weasley's mouth had dropped open, and he was looking at him incredulously, and not just a little. envious. Hermione was rolling her eyes at Weasley and elbowing him, and Harry was grinning, raising his eyebrows at Draco. Draco smiled back before biting his lip, keen to assume a neutral expression. The last thing he wanted was to chase Krum away again. Dumbledore, Karkaroff, and Maxime were the last people to enter the Great Hall, and the Beauxbatons students leapt to their feet as their headmistress passed by, causing some Hogwarts students to laugh. Draco, though, knew that the French had a different culture when it came to showing respect for their mentors, so he just watched without comment as the headmasters and headmistress made their way across the room and took their seats at the staff table. Only Dumbledore remained standing, and the crowd of students fell silent.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, ghosts, and, most particularly, guests.
Dumbledore boomed, a bright smile on his face.
I have a great pleasure in welcoming you all to Hogwarts. I hope and trust that your stay here will both be comfortable and enjoyable.
He ignored a derisive snort coming from some Beauxbatons student and continued.
The tournament will be officially opened at the end of the feast. I now invite you all to eat, drink, and make yourselves at home.
At his indication, the tables filled with a much greater variety of dishes than was usually even for feasts, seemingly from different corners of Europe. Draco noted French and Spanish dishes he had eaten before on family holidays, as well as dishes that, if pressed, he would sort somewhere into the Russian or Balkan cuisine. He noted that across from him, Krum was considering one of the British dishes, looking unsure. "That's Lancashire hot pot," Draco told him, making the other boy look up. "It's got lamb inside."
Oh, Krum frowned. I thought it was shepherd's pie. I had it this summer. It was very good.
"This is shepherd's pie," Draco indicated to another dish not far from them. "Both are good, though. I know British cuisine is infamous in Europe, but the Hogwarts house elves really are superb. There is no need to worry about the food."
I see.
Krum nodded, reaching out to put some shepherd's pie onto his plate. "Do you know by any chance what these are?" Draco asked, indicating to a few meals he was not familiar with. "I think this is ghoulish, but the rest—"
That is stroganoff, Krum told him. It is beef. Over there is shashlik, and those, he pointed to a couple of dumplings, are pelmeni. They have meat or fish inside.
"I see," Draco nodded, putting some of each onto his plate out of curiosity.
What is your name?
Krum asked, taking in his face. "Draco Malfoy." Draco introduced himself, holding out his hand for Krum to shake.
Victor Krum,
he replied, returning the gesture. "I know," Draco smiled. "I saw you at the Quidditch World Cup. You were amazing."
Thank you,
Krum said politely, pulling his hand away again and turning to his plate. They ate in a silence that wasn't particularly uncomfortable, and Draco realized that Krum did not even communicate with his fellow students. He wondered for a moment if his fame isolated him from his peers, or if he just enjoyed being alone. Halfway through dinner, Ludo Bagman and Barty Crouch arrived and joined the staff table. Both he and Krum observed their entrance with a frown and caught each other's eyes for a moment.
They are from your ministry, are they not?
Krum asked gruffly. "Yes," Draco nodded. "Head of Magical Games and Sports, and Head of International Magical Cooperation."
I see.
Krum nodded.
I saw them at the World Cup.
"Yes, they were there," Draco agreed. Krum nodded and examined the pudding that had started to appear on the table. They exchanged names and ingredients of desserts again, and Krum ended up trying some treacle tart, Harry's favorite, while Draco ate his way through some pastry he could not pronounce. When the tables finally cleared of food, Dumbledore got to his feet again, a smile on his face. The hall was enveloped by an excited silence.
The moment has come,
Dumbledore announced.
The Triwizard Tournament is about to start. I would like to say a few words of explanation before we bring in the casket just to clarify the procedure we will be following this year. But firstly, let me introduce...
He proceeded to present both Crouch and Bagman to the crowd before continuing,
Mr. Bagman and Mr. Crouch have worked tirelessly over the last few months on the arrangements for the Triwizard Tournament. and they will be joining myself, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxine on the panel which will judge the champions' efforts.
He smiled at the tension that seemed to travel over the students at the words champions, and instructed Filch to bring in the casket. Filch then brought in what looked like an ancient, though elegantly adorned, wooden chest. As the caretaker placed it on the table before him, Dumbledore continued explaining the basics of the tournament. 3 champions, 1 from each school, having to face 3 tasks throughout the school year that would test their magical prowess, their daring, their power of deduction, as well as their ability to cope with danger. They'd receive marks for their performance in each task, and the champion with the highest total would win the Triwizard Cup.
The champions will be chosen by an impartial selector,
Dumbledore announced at last.
The Goblet of Fire.
He tapped the chest Filch had set onto the table in front of him 3 times with his wand until it jumped open to reveal a large wooden cup filled with lazily flickering blue flames. Dumbledore placed the cup on top of the chest.
Anybody wishing to submit themselves as champion must write their name and school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it into the goblet,
He explained.
Aspiring champions have 24 hours in which to put their names forward. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the goblet will return the names of the 3 it has judged the most worthy to represent their schools. The goblet will be placed in the entrance hall tonight, where it will be freely accessible to all those wishing to compete. To ensure that no underage students yield to temptation, I will be drawing an age line around the Goblet of Fire. Once it has been placed in the entrance hall, nobody under the age of 17 will be able to cross this line.
As Dumbledore proceeded to impress upon them the seriousness of the decision whether or not to put their names forward, Draco threw a look over to the Gryffindor table where the Weasley twins were sitting not far from their brother, Harry and Hermione, attentively listening to Dumbledore's every word. He had heard them boasting that they'd find a way to compete, and he knew that no one would be able to talk any sense into them or convince them that it was a hopeless endeavor. He was looking forward to whatever commotion they would cause with their failed attempts, though.
Now I think it is time for bed,
Dumbledore concluded, smiling into the round.
Good night to all of you.
The twins immediately turned to each other to converse in excited whispers, and Draco snorted under his breath as he got to his feet.
Will you put in your name?
Crom spoke up, examining Draco as if to judge his age. Me? Draco laughed. Merlin, no! I'm too young anyway, but good luck to you.
I see. Crom nodded. Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Draco smiled, watching as Crom left the great hall with the other Durmstrang students. Draco, on the other hand, could barely get to the door before he was cornered by Weasley.
You absolute shit!
He hissed, though he sounded more odd than angry.
What did you talk about? What did he say? Can you introduce me?
By Salazar Weasley, if you don't shut up, I'll drag you to Madame Pomfrey for a calming draught. He laughed. We didn't talk all that much, just about the food mostly. He asked me if I was going to put my name forward for the tournament. Things like that.
I'm so jealous.
Weasley almost whined. Ron, he's a person like you and me. Hermione rolled her eyes.
He's the best singer in the world, Hermione!
Weasley argued. I think he doesn't like the attention much, though. Draco frowned. That's why he sat with me, I guess. Because I was sitting alone and wasn't wetting myself about getting close to him. Weasley glared at him, probably taking his words personally, but Draco just turned to look at Harry. He actually reminded me a little of you, he said. You've always been uncomfortable in the public eye, too.
Yeah.
Harry made a face.
I can relate all too well.
The following day was a weird one. When Draco entered the Great Hall for breakfast around the usual time, not only were his friends already through with their own food, but the tables were surprisingly filled for the early hour on a weekend. He was waved over to the Gryffindor table to eat and be caught up on the happenings of the morning. How the Weasley twins and their friend had tried to get one over Dumbledore by taking an aging potion and had consequently found themselves with beards that had to be removed by Madame Pomfrey and the list of Hogwarts students that were rumored to have put their names forward.
We can't have a Slytherin champion,
Harry called, incredulous when Thomas mentioned Warrington. He quickly turned to Draco, embarrassed and muttering,
I mean,
"Don't bother," Draco snorted. "It's not like I'm friends with any of them." "All the Hufflepuffs are talking about Diggory," Finnegan muttered, rolling his eyes.
Not him,
Draco moaned. "I hate him."
just because he beat you at Quidditch last year,
Hermione interjected with a smile.
he's arrogant,
Draco sniffed.
and just because he has a pretty face does not mean he's suited to represent our school. He's a Hufflepuff!
he was nice enough when we met him at the World Cup.
Harry shrugged, smirking when Draco glared at him.
Traitor!
He snapped, but Hermione shushed him when cheers filtered in from the entrance hall, indicating that someone new had thrown their name into the goblet. One of the Gryffindor chasers, Angelina Johnson, then entered the Great Hall with an embarrassed smile on her face, and the Gryffindors surrounding him proceeded to declare their complete support to her while Draco continued eating. They decided to visit Hagrid throughout the day, and that trip went more than a little unusual as well. Madame Maxime's arrival at the school had obviously made an immense impression on Hagrid, for he was dressed in his finest suit, which wouldn't have been allowed into the manor even as a washcloth, and had attempted to slick down his hair, with disastrous results. He also abandoned them on the way up to the castle for dinner in favor of the headmistress of Beauxbatons, which Draco found more amusing than insulting, but left especially Hermione quite indignant, though he assumed that had more to do with Hagrid having turned down her elf right movement without a second thought only a short while before. When they took their seats at their respective house tables, the mood in the Great Hall was sizzling with tension and excitement, and Draco found it quite catching. Victor Crumb came back to sit with him, which pleased him immensely. He did not usually have the pleasure of company at the Slytherin table, not to mention that of a famous Quidditch player. "You put your name into the goblet earlier?" Draco asked as they dug into their meals. Crumb just shrugged and nodded. "Well, good luck. I'm rooting for you."
Thank you,
he said.
Is there anyone you support for your school?
"Not really," Draco shrugged. "My friends are all for Angelina Johnson because she's from their house, but I don't really care, to be honest. Though I guess rather her than Diggory."
You are friends with Harry Potter, are you not?
Crumb asked suddenly.
I saw you with him this morning at breakfast.
"I am," Draco confirmed, smiling. "Ever since first year." Crumb just nodded, pausing to eat some of his ghoulish before he continued.
Why do you not sit with them if they are your friends?
"Oh, it's not really common to sit somewhere that's not your house table at Hogwarts," Draco explained. "Sometimes we do it anyway, but if I dare to break etiquette at an official occasion like this one, Snape would have my head. Professor Snape is Slytherin's head of house," Draco added at Crumb's confused frown. "The word fun is not really in his vocabulary. I don't think anyone has ever seen him smile unless it was out of malice."
I see,
Crumb said. "Do you have a system like that at Durmstrang?" Draco asked curiously. "The houses, I mean."
No.
Crumb frowned.
No, but we are divided by your mother tongues. At Durmstrang, we have students from all over Europe, you see. So we have language classes to make sure we cannot speak either German or Russian. Each lesson is taught in both languages, and you have to choose one. Teachers have to speak both as well. And the language teachers speak lots more, so they can help everyone.
"So you basically hang out with either the kids that speak Russian or the kids that speak German?" Draco inquired.
Mostly.
Crumb agreed.
Or those from your country.
"And here I thought the house system was restrictive, but I guess it's not much different without it either." Draco frowned.
I think no matter where you are, you will always find a few good friends and be with them.
Crumb shrugged. "You're probably right," Draco agreed. "What about your friends? Did none of them come?"
No,
Crumb replied, looking wistful for a moment.
Andre wanted to concentrate on his studies, and Stoyan's parents did not want him to come to Britain after what happened at the World Cup.
"Oh," Draco made a face. "That sucks." He paused, then offered tentatively, "If you ever want company, feel free to hang out with me and my friends. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. Though I won't vouch for anything Weasley says or does. He can be very fanboyish." Crumb smiled at that, and it was the first time Draco had seen the other boy smile. It transformed his face completely. Draco felt quite pleased with himself.
Thank you,
he said.
You are very kind, Draco.
I guess I just know what it's like to be alone. Draco shrugged, feeling a little awkward at the praise. When the tables were finally cleared of dishes, Dumbledore got to his feet and the students immediately fell silent.
Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision,
The headmaster announced.
I estimate that it requires 1 more minute. Now, when the champions' names are called, I would ask them please to come up to the top of the hall, walk along the staff table, and go into the next chamber where they will be receiving their first instructions.
Dumbledore extinguished most of the candles with a wave of his wand, leaving the Goblet of Fire as the most prominent light source, drawing the eyes of every person in the room. The blue flames continued crackling, and everyone seemed to hold their breath. Then the flames turned into a sudden vivid red, glowing and emitting sparks until with a huge spit of fire, it released the charred piece of parchment into the air. Dumbledore caught it and held it in the light to read.
The champion for Durmstrang,
He announced.
will be Victor Crumb.
Cheers broke out throughout. Students from all schools and Draco joined in, grinning at Crumb, whose face twitched into a small smile in return before he stood, his face straight and proud, as he walked up to the front of the hall. Maybe, Draco mused, if the Hogwarts champion turned out to be less than satisfactory, he would end up rooting for Durmstrang. When Crumb had left the hall through the door behind the staff table, the applause ceased, and the tension rose once more as the flames turned red again. A second parchment was emitted from the searing flames, and Dumbledore caught it, announcing,
The champion for Beauxbatons will be Fleur Delacour.
The girl that got to her feet had silvery blonde hair, not unlike Draco's own, and was very pretty and graceful. She, too, walked towards the staff table in a stance that radiated pride and dignity, while their schoolmates showed their disappointment in a less dignified manner of anger and despair. When Delacour had followed Crumb into the chamber, everyone's attention returned immediately to the goblet, the air so tense you could probably slice right through it with a hex. Draco bit his lip as the fire turned red again, and the flames spit out a third piece of parchment, which, again, Dumbledore caught with an easy movement before reading it.
The Hogwarts champion,
He called.
is Cedric Diggory.
No! Draco moaned, but he could barely hear himself over the uproar from the Hufflepuff table. Diggory, smug as he was grinning as he got to his feet and made his way towards the staff table. Draco looked over at the Gryffindor table, catching Harry's eyes. He made a face, expressing his displeasure, and Harry laughed.
Excellent,
Dumbledore called, as Diggory, too, had left the room.
Well, we now have our 3 champions. I am sure I can count upon all of you, including the remaining students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster.
Draco grimaced.
By cheering your champion on, you will contribute in a very real...
But Dumbledore trailed off, staring like everyone else, when the flames in the goblet turned once more from blue to red. Again, the flames grew, and finally another piece of parchment shot out of them. Dumbledore caught the parchment in apparent shock and turned to read it. There was a moment of deep silence as everyone watched him, waiting for him to speak up. At last, Dumbledore cleared his throat, a deep frown on his face as he said one name that made Draco's blood turn to ice.
Harry Potter.